For years, MASH was seen as a perfect mix of humor, heartbreak, and humanity. A show where its cast appeared as close off-screen as their characters were on it. But behind that laughter and camaraderie, something darker simmered. Gary Burghoff, the man who played the lovable and innocent Radar O'Reilly, became the center of deep resentment among his castmates. What could make someone hate the sweetest face in the 4077th? The truth, buried beneath years of rumors and silence, reveals a story no fan of MASH ever expected to hear. The rise of Radar O'Reilly. Gary Burghoff's connection to Radar began long before the television phenomenon that would define his life. In 1970, when visionary filmmaker Robert Altman set out to adapt MASH for the big screen, he cast the 26-year-old stage actor and jazz drummer from Connecticut in a small but memorable role, that of the young, wide-eyed company clerk, Walter Radar O'Reilly. Burghoff was then a relative unknown, performing in regional theater and off-Broadway. But Altman saw something in him, an innocence that could anchor the chaos of a war satire. Gary's performance, filled with awkward gestures and a natural sweetness, left a deep impression despite his limited screen time. It was Radar who became the emotional thread that softened the sharp edges of Altman's cynical masterpiece. 2 years later, when CBS took a gamble on adapting the film into a weekly television series, Gary was the only actor asked to reprise his role. He was flattered, but hesitant. Altman's film had been a raw, rebellious commentary on authority, a spirit that television often sanitized. Gary feared that the complex tone of MASH would be diluted by network rules and canned laughter, yet the temptation to revisit Radar, to expand him beyond comic relief into a fully realized soul within the madness of war, proved too powerful to resist. When the series premiered on September 17, 1972, it quietly redefined American television. Though set in Korea, MASH aired during the height of the Vietnam War, and its audience understood the subtext immediately. Soldiers, doctors, and civilians saw their own disillusionment reflected in every episode. Amid the chaos, Radar stood apart, the boyish clerk who could hear helicopters before anyone else and somehow preserved his innocence amid the blood and bureaucracy. By the second season, critics were calling him the heart of the 4077th, and fan mail poured in from around the world. Viewers adored his stammered "sir," his shy posture, and his ever-present teddy bear. Many of these touches, the bear, the nervous tics, the quiet moments of empathy, were Gary's inventions, drawn from instinct rather than script. But success became its own battlefield. As the show's other leads, Alan Alda, Wayne Rogers, McLean Stevenson, grew into complex adult characters, Gary was asked to remain eternally boyish. Radar could not change, even as everyone around him did. Producers insisted that the innocence stay intact. Audiences demanded that sweetness every week. The pressure to preserve that image was suffocating. Gary began to internalize every criticism, every note from the writer's room, every scene that didn't feel authentic. He was a perfectionist, trapped inside a role that no longer belonged to him. The public's affection, while sincere, created an invisible prison. The more they loved Radar, the more Gary feared that he would never again be seen as anything else. Behind the scenes, exhaustion crept in. The shooting days were long, the scripts demanding, and the emotional tone of the show shifted from pure comedy to tragic realism. Gary, who carried the burden of embodying the show's innocence, felt it most acutely. While others could vent through sarcasm or gallows humor, he absorbed the melancholy of each episode. The line between actor and character began to blur. Off camera, he withdrew, quiet, introspective, searching for balance. On camera, he delivered performances of remarkable depth, each one tinged with real fatigue and fragility. By the time MASH entered its middle seasons, the strain had started to show. What had once been a joyful role was now a heavy obligation. Radar's purity made the show human, but for Gary Burghoff, maintaining that purity amid fame and expectation became nearly impossible. The innocence that defined him on screen was slowly consuming him in real life, and though no one could see it yet, the seeds of conflict and departure had already been sown. When admiration turned to resentment. The first cracks appeared between Gary and Wayne Rogers, who played trapper John McIntyre. In the early seasons, their chemistry was undeniable, the cool surgeon teasing the nervous clerk. But life on a set that filmed up to 14 hours a day was hardly playful. Rogers was meticulous, a man who hit his marks and delivered his lines with precision. Gary, by contrast, was emotional. He sometimes questioned dialogue or asked for additional takes until he felt the truth of a moment. At first, Wayne admired his commitment. Then the delays started costing time and money. Tension simmered. According to accounts later cited in Raymond Straight's 1983 biography, Alan Alda, one afternoon, Rogers finally exploded. During a scene rewrite that Gary challenged yet again, Wayne slammed a chair across the set. It missed Gary, but the message was clear. He'd had enough. The crew froze. Production shut down for the day. Both men returned the next morning as professionals, yet everyone sensed a chill that never lifted. Rogers left the series after season 3, officially over contract disputes, but privately, colleagues knew that constant friction with producers and cast, including Burghoff, had drained him. McLean Stevenson, the warm-hearted Colonel Henry Blake, tried to keep peace. "Sometimes I was a problem for him, and sometimes he was a problem for me," he admitted years later. Their rapport swung between laughter and silent irritation. Gary's hypersensitivity collided with Stevenson's improvisational looseness. Small slights could spiral into hurt feelings, yet Stevenson never denied Gary's brilliance. "He made Radar real," he said. By season 4, Alan Alda had become the creative leader of MASH, co-writing scripts, directing episodes, shaping tone. Gary, meanwhile, felt overlooked. Radar's innocence rarely evolved, and he longed to explore darker layers. Whenever he suggested changes, Alda often vetoed them to protect the show's balance. To Gary, it felt personal. To Alda, it was professional. Mutual respect eroded. As MASH grew more political, Gary's role grew smaller, and his frustration more visible. Crew members recalled that he'd sit alone between takes, sketching or quietly tuning a drum instead of chatting. The once beloved kid brother of the cast now seemed withdrawn. The tension was real, but so was exhaustion. 7 years of filming had blurred friendship and fatigue, and soon Gary Burghoff would decide he'd had enough, a decision that nearly derailed the show's most emotional goodbye. The farewell that almost ruined everything. By 1979, Gary was ready to walk away. The pressure of fame had become unbearable, and his marriage was faltering under the weight of absence. He told producers he wanted out after season 7. They convinced him to stay long enough for a proper send-off. Writers crafted a 2-part farewell. Goodbye, Radar, airing in season 8, where his character would return home to Iowa after his uncle's death. It was a fitting, tender conclusion, but on set, art and ego collided. Director Charles S. Dubin envisioned Radar's exit as quiet and restrained, the boy who had held the camp together slipping away unnoticed while others worked to save lives. Gary disagreed. He wanted catharsis, a breakdown, tears, and a dramatic collapse. "If I were you," Dubin cautioned, "I'd fight the tears." Gary shook his head. "No, let me do it my way. The cameras rolled." He wept openly, voice breaking, hands trembling. The crew applauded out of courtesy, but Dubin's face said everything. The next morning's dailies proved him right. The scene felt forced, overwrought, almost theatrical. Gary was mortified. "It was awful," he later told the producers of MASH, the comedy that changed television. The director was right. I was wrong. He begged to reshoot. Dubin agreed, on one condition: no tears. This time, Radar simply walks away as helicopters arrive with wounded soldiers. No party, no speeches, just the sound of work resuming. That understated exit became one of the series' most haunting moments, a reminder that war doesn't pause for goodbyes. Gary's perfectionism had nearly ruined the farewell, but in failing, he delivered his greatest performance. The final cut moved millions. Yet behind the applause, murmurs persisted. Some castmates saw the incident as proof of his controlling streak. Others saw a man desperate to leave a piece of himself behind. Either way, when Radar boarded that last truck out of Korea, Gary Burghoff effectively left Hollywood behind with him. He later admitted the scene humbled him. MASH wasn't about one person's emotion, he said. It was about how war swallows everyone's humanity. The tragedy was that he realized it only after it nearly cost him his legacy. Rumors, regrets, and reality. When the episode aired in October 1979, viewers cried, critics raved, and the rumor mill exploded. Tabloids claimed the cast had thrown an off-screen party to celebrate Gary's departure. Headlines branded him difficult, moody, even arrogant. Few bothered to ask why he'd really left. The truth was painfully simple. He was burnt out. The MASH schedule consumed 10 months a year. Between long shooting days and promotional tours, Gary barely saw his wife and 2 small children. Audiences think you have to be the person they see on screen, he later explained. The truth is, Radar was a better person than I'll ever be. Living up to that purity, both on and off camera, was exhausting. He wanted to be a present father, not a mythical figure trapped in reruns. His co-stars understood more than the gossip implied. Jamie Farr, beloved as Corporal Klinger, admitted in a 2024 MeTV interview, "I told Gary his leaving might be bad for the show and bad for him, but I couldn't talk him out of it." Loretta Swit, who played Major Houlihan, remembered joyous and funny moments with him, but acknowledged that he had withdrawn from the group. "Gary refuses to fly," she said in 2018. "It's hard to get him in one place where we can all gather." Alan Alda, once seen as his rival, eventually reached out in friendship. On his Clear and Vivid podcast reunion in 2019, Alda spoke warmly about the entire cast, singling out Gary's contribution as the heartbeat that kept us honest. In 2022, he tweeted, "Happy birthday, Gary. The world sends you love. Me too." For fans who believed the rumors, those gestures rewrote the story. There had been friction, yes, but no lasting hatred. The so-called feud was less about animosity and more about 2 strong creative wills colliding under unbearable pressure. When the cameras stopped, they all carried scars. Gary's just happened to be the most visible. The irony was that, by leaving, he preserved Radar's innocence forever. The character never had to grow bitter, and neither did the audience's memory of him. It was Gary Burghoff's quiet gift, and his heaviest burden. Life after MASH, the man behind the myth. After MASH, Gary disappeared from Hollywood's glare. A few guest roles followed, a short-lived spin-off pilot, Walter, in 1984, some regional theater, voice work, even wildlife painting, but he resisted the fame machine entirely. He settled into a life without airports, red carpets, or deadlines. "I don't fly," he often said. "I like being where my feet are." Years later, fans discovered another side of him, the humanitarian. In 2018, he appeared in a YouTube video with his grown children to support victims of California's wildfires, helping raise more than $16,000 through GoFundMe. He spoke softly, thanking donors and urging kindness. It was pure Radar, without the uniform. Privately, he reflected on the contradictions that defined him. The same sensitivity that made his acting so believable also made the industry unbearable. "You give too much of yourself," he once confessed. "When the camera stops, there's nothing left." He poured that empathy into painting animals, composing music, and mentoring young performers away from the spotlight. By the mid-2020s, he was living quietly in California, a father, grandfather, and symbol of a gentler era of television. Meanwhile, time did what time always does. Many of his colleagues passed on: McLean Stevenson in 1996, Harry Morgan in 2011, David Ogden Stiers in 2018, and most recently Loretta Swit. Yet fans still write to Gary, thanking him for teaching them that goodness can survive even in war. In every rerun, Radar walks into the tent again, and for 25 minutes, the world feels kind. For a man once accused of being difficult, Gary's legacy is remarkably peaceful. The so-called hatred that once surrounded him has dissolved into admiration. What remains is the image of a young clerk who could hear helicopters before anyone else. A metaphor, perhaps, for an actor who sensed pain long before the rest of us did. The story of Gary Burghoff isn't just about an on-set feud. It's about what happens when art demands more than a person can give. The pressure to stay lovable, the exhaustion of pretending to be fine, the misunderstandings that grow when sensitivity meets ambition, all of it collided in one man's struggle to remain true to himself. For a time, he was misunderstood, even resented. But in hindsight, every conflict, every rumor, and every tear that he fought back on screen now feels like part of a larger truth. He wasn't difficult. He was human. When audiences watch MASH today, they don't see the tension or the fatigue. They see a young soldier clutching a teddy bear, reminding us that compassion still matters. The real tragedy is that it took decades for the world, and maybe even his colleagues, to understand the man behind that innocence. Gary Burghoff once said, "It wasn't about fame for me." It never was. Maybe that's why his portrayal of Radar still feels timeless. He didn't chase applause, he chased truth. And though the headlines once shouted about hatred and ego, history now whispers something different: forgiveness, respect, and quiet gratitude. So perhaps the better question isn't who hated him, but who truly knew him. What do you think? Did Gary Burghoff make the right choice leaving MASH when he did? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more untold stories from the legends of television history.